And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. A lot of people, including my old boss Bernie Sanders, have been saying that the bills that are on the table now from the administration, meaning the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the additional $3.5 trillion framework, as it's called, being laid out by the administration and Democrats on Capitol Hill. Bernie keeps saying this is the greatest legislation in terms of scope since Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I was wondering if that was true. And I thought, who better to ask about it than my good friend Harvey J. Kaye, who is an expert in the presidency of Franklin D. and the life of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Harvey, excuse me, Harvey Kaye is a historian. He's a sociologist. He's the author of a number of books, including Thomas Paine and The Promise of America and The Fight for the Four Freedoms, the four freedoms being, of course, FDR's ideals, as well as the collected or selected speeches and writings of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So without any further ado, Harvey, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. You know, I so enjoyed talking with you. When I got the invitation, I said, I'm not going to pass up this opportunity.
Well, the feeling is very mutual, and I always welcome these talks and get so much out of it. And let's dive right into it. I mean, without debating, there's no need, in my view, to debate the merits of doing some of the things in these bills, replacing bad lead pipes and, rebuilding some crumbling infrastructure. And then in the broader package, the specifics not worked out, but the ideals of, more and better home care with better paid workers and a variety of other things as well. I don't think there's any, between us and people like us, debate that these things are good things to do. But the rhetoric that I've heard is, is we keep hearing FDR, FDR. And I had some thoughts on it, but I was really interested to know what your thoughts were on that comparison.
Well, just with reference to the FDR, as I think we've talked a couple of times, right away, maybe even before he was inaugurated, there was talk, and Bernie maybe feeling bad about having lost or having pulled out before it was fully tested. The fact is that, everyone was talking about this will be the new FDR administration. And clearly, if based on the idea of the first 100 days, this ain't no FDR administration. Okay, the American Rescue Plan, all well and good. I mean, a wonderful initiative, but a very temporary initiative for 1 year. And so much time has been spent trying to figure out exactly what they want to do, trying to figure out how they can possibly coax Manchin and Sinema, and they've done a pretty bad job of that, I think, because we still don't know if both the $1 trillion plan, which made it through the Senate, and the even more significant in some ways, decidedly in financial terms and in social implications, the $3.5 trillion plan will go through. And let's not forget that, the civil engineers, American civil engineers, whatever the title of their society is, they projected, I think, a need of $10 trillion spent on infrastructure. And that wouldn't even have included the kinds of social initiatives that are going to be part of the second plan. Anyhow, and let me also say, and I don't mean to take up our time, but it clearly is the case.
Please do. That's why you're here.
Okay, yeah. Well, I can't help but observe on the side that, they've spent so much time with Manchin and Sinema. The Republicans must, in spite of the fact that 19 Republicans, I guess it is, voted to advance this bill, the fact is that they have wasted so much time in this administration. Look, we don't have a voting rights plan that's gone through. We don't have a labor rights plan that has gone through. And you can imagine right now, I mean, if I were McConnell, I'd be celebrating, not necessarily the infrastructure plan, though Kentucky desperately needs probably all the monies that'll come their way. But he'd be celebrating because look how much he's distracted people from the reality of the fact that time is running out to do anything about all of these laws that are being enacted and all this gerrymandering that's about to take place. I mean, it's frustrating as hell. You can imagine. I'm sure you share that frustration. Well, yeah, but the question regarding the infrastructure plan is interesting, and I apologize to listeners and viewers that I don't have a dollar comparison to make. I actually don't have the total spent or anything like that. And I'll also make it very clear, because I know as soon as this gets out on Twitter, the commentary is, well, FDR had Congress sewn up, right? But let's also make it clear that he had it sewn up regarding perhaps infrastructure, yes, but he didn't have it sewn up. He had the Southern Democrats, the white supremacists, to deal with. So much of the social initiatives had to literally find its way through a white supremacist dominated Congress. And I say that because they chaired the committees. And the other thing I want to say is that if we actually look back, and I'm gonna apologize for what I'm about to do, I'm gonna read some lines from my book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, because I couldn't maybe there are those who could remember the numbers, but I think it's important to hear the numbers of what took place during that period of time. And this is strictly on infrastructure, okay? So there were 3 million young men between 1933 and 1942 who served in the Civilian Conservation Corps. They planted 2.3 billion trees on 2.5 million acres of previously barren, denuded, or unproductive land. They fought soil erosion on 40 million acres of farmland, and they developed 800 new state parks. The CWA, which is a very temporary thing, the Civil Works Administration, employed 4.5 million people during the harshest months of 33 and 34. They built or improved 500,000 miles of roads, 40,000 schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if I throw in playgrounds, athletic fields, and airports. The WPA, which was part of what was called the Second New Deal, which was basically, it was a massive appropriations bill, and FDR signed an executive order to create the most famous of all these things, perhaps the Works Progress Administration, that employed 8.5 million people between 35 and the early stages of the war. And they upgraded 600,000 miles of rural roads. They laid 67,000 miles of city streets. They erected 78,000 new bridges and viaducts, and they constructed 40,000 public buildings and several hundred airports. Now, then there's a PWA, which I won't give you all the numbers, but the PWA was the project where they gave out contracts to do the huge projects, okay? And among those things would probably be, Boulder Dam, Grand Coulee, Bonneville Dams, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, and I could go on and on and on, right? And then, of course, there's the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which literally created dams and created employment and rescued a region from devastating poverty, okay, and provided jobs to tens of thousands of people. And even now, I got to tell you, I watch House Hunters sometimes, or shows like that. And there's one called Lakefront Bargain Hunt, I think it is, where families look for lakefront homes. And half of the time, especially down south, they are looking for homes on a lake that I look up on Google, and it turns out it's a lake created by the TVA, okay, down in Tennessee or Alabama, right? And I always ask myself, how come the House Hunters never mentions how public employment and public initiative enable these people today to have these kinds of recreation. Okay, and then there's the one that I really think is important to note is the Rural Electrification Administration, I should say, the REA, because this is the kind of thing that we might be seeing, but we're not sure we'll be seeing in the recent the bill that passed the other day through the Senate regarding broadband for rural areas and stuff. The Rural Electrification Agency was an initiative that FDR really wanted to see because he knew how many farms around the country had absolutely no electric power. And the fact was that the big utility companies that were corporate capitalist utility companies would not bother to run power lines into certain regions, especially in the South, because they said, we're not going to make any real profit off of this. So FDR said, to hell with the idea of profit. We're going to create cooperatives. Okay. So they created, I believe it was 400 local power cooperatives, especially in the South. And they provided electricity to homes and farms and the barns to somewhere between 300 to 500,000 farmsteads. And I don't have the figure right because it varies from region to region on that. The point is, it was a truly public works revolution. It was an unprecedented infrastructure projects, okay, unprecedented. Now, on that scale, it is very hard to see how the current endeavors will quite live up to being as Bernie, it will be the biggest thing since FDR, perhaps. But that might lead us to believe it will be on the scale of the New Deal, and we're not there yet. Okay, we're not there yet. That's the kind of stuff we should keep in mind when we talk about this. Just the sheer numbers of people who are engaged in all of these projects, and admittedly, especially in the southern part of the country, there was discrimination against African American employment and so on, but it decidedly did include African Americans in diverse parts of the country, including the South, though not on the scale perhaps originally intended. But it was just extraordinary. Now, I don't want to take away from what's happening now. Again,
Right.
I mean, Biden has to deal with a Republican Party that couldn't give a damn about democracy. Okay, about with not just two. Not I mentioned Manchin and Sinema, but let's not forget there were several Democrats who voted against including the $15 minimum wage in Bernie's original initiative, and most tellingly, the two senators from Delaware, who Biden should have been able to call into his office and say, "Are you kidding me? Make this happen," right? I mean, as I understand it, Chris Coons was Biden's mentee, right? And you mean to say that he literally gave the finger to Joe Biden without any kind of any sense that Biden didn't care very much? So, look, this is a wonderful infrastructure plan that just went through, but it's got problems. And let me go back. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I'll stop.
No, that's okay. But no, I want to hear you talk. That's why you're here. But a couple thoughts. One is, first of all, it's always important to me when we talk about population numbers, 3 million people in the Civilian Conservation Corps, to remind ourselves that in 1933, the population of the United States as a whole was 125 million.
Right.
So on an adjusted basis, it's more like 7-8 million people being employed today. It's a massive.
That's
number.
Right.
And you've really kind of touched on. I didn't look up the numbers either. I haven't yet, anyway. But you touched on one of the things that was very much on my mind when I started thinking about this comparison, which is it's not just a matter of quantitative comparison, but what FDR did was qualitatively a dramatic shift in the role of the federal government in American life, wasn't it? I mean, and so
yes.
To me, it was like this Copernican shift in the way,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, think about it this way. How many years, decades, you and I are old enough to think in decades, right? How many years have we heard people talk, when they talk about job creation and all of that, they always talk about giving tax breaks, tax benefits, tax write-offs, tax exemptions to big business. FDR didn't give a damn about that. Admittedly, at the outset, he was trying to be kind to big business. He allowed a certain cartelization to take place, but he learned soon enough that you couldn't trust big business. The capitalists have their own agenda. And as he said, ultimately, I welcome their hatred. And he turned around, especially by way of the second New Deal, but then furthermore, the enhancement of the CCC that took place. And what did he do? He basically said, we're going to do this through public initiative. He quoted Lincoln. Lincoln back in the 1860s said, look, government does for us what we can't do as individuals or small groups. It's literally us on a grand scale. And I think that's what FDR believed. And when he quoted Lincoln, as he once told one of his friends, well, the Republicans don't seem to want Lincoln. Let's make him one of our own. And in essence, Lincoln, and by the way, it's not our topic, but Lincoln really was a proto-social democrat, okay?
Mm-hmm.
FDR, and I don't need to argue it, it was either a great FDR liberal or, in my book, a social democrat. The making of social democracy is rooted in those New Deal years in this country. And unfortunately, sort of, we allowed it to run out of steam somewhere in the late 60s and early 70s. But you're right. I mean, it radically transformed Americans' understandings of their relationship to government and radically changed the role of government in addressing the needs of working people, in addressing the needs of the poor, and in addressing the needs of all citizens by way of infrastructure development. I mean, I would bet if people took the time people took the time to go out and go around their communities, their cities, they would be amazed at how many New Deal projects they just took. They just said, "Oh, it's that building or
Right.
it's that park." It's funny. I'll tell a little story to put a human face on this. There's a young man. He's 19, 20, couldn't be older than 22, up in Bemidji, Minnesota. And he launched a little podcast, which he does every so often. And he asked me would I come on. And I think it's imperative as a professor emeritus that I continue to cultivate young people and their ambitions. So I went on with him. And since then, we've gotten to know each other. And he contacted me a few weeks ago to say, could he talk to me? He wants to run for the city council in Bemidji. I said, great. And he said, I really want to talk to you because I want to show you my plans. And I want to hear your thoughts on how I can present this as a fundamentally American set of initiatives that I'd like to pursue. And they really, believe me, this guy had read his FDR, you might say. So, but what's interesting is he didn't mention FDR at that moment. And I said to him, Brady's his name. I said, Brady, I have an idea for you. Why don't you Google Bemidji and the surrounding communities, which included at least one Native American reservation, and find out where the New Deal projects are. And we did that together when we were talking. And he said, oh, man, this is great. Right. So it's as if they didn't even realize the lodge in the local park was built by, the WPA. So my point is that it literally transformed the American landscape in every region of the United States, whether it had to do with the post offices that small communities got, with murals that they hired unemployed artists to create, over to the parks and recreation, over to the bridges we drive across. Well, hopefully we're not driving on all of those same bridges. That's what happened and why we desperately need infrastructure today. Yeah. But it's just, the numbers are astounding, absolutely astounding. Now, can we say this is going to happen? I forgot. Do you recall the number of people they're projecting to be a part of the Civilian Climate Corps, I think it's called?
I don't recall. No,
it might be on the scale of 100,000, and they don't.
Yeah, it was small. It was relatively small.
I mean, it's not at all on the scale. I mean, it's that kind of thing. I mentioned that Rural Electrification Agency in some ways as a historical comparison to what we now have in the recent infrastructure bill. This new infrastructure bill that made it through the Senate, and I hope the House does not act upon any of this until they can put the two bills through in tandem. They're supposed to provide broadband service to rural areas. Now, it's interesting that in going through the hoops, there was something that was removed from this. By the way, and I will say I'm not as on top of this as David Day in this, as you can imagine. But he notes the fact that there was something eliminated from the bill as it made its way through. Originally, I think it was called the American Jobs Plan. And it had to do with the fact that in these rural areas, in many a state, they're not allowed to set up cooperatives or municipal projects of this sort. Okay, because of course the big telecom companies, the last thing they want to do is hand over anything to anybody, in spite of the fact they're unwilling to service those areas. So, right. In the original bill as projected, there was supposed to be a change in the law, basically to override all of the state laws that prevented the creation of co-ops. In other words, exactly what FDR did back in the mid-30s. So it's now set. So now the bill that went through doesn't have that in there. It got removed. So okay, now basically, what are the big companies? Comcast, I guess I forget the names of all of them. But AT&T, are they still in that business? I mean, it's those folks who, they'll have a monopoly, and basically, the kinds of things that I'll put it in the kind of terms everyone will understand. When these things happen, assuming they do, there will be trucks coming into those areas, and they will have Comcast on the side, or Spectrum possibly. In FDR's day, it might have, if we could envision the FDR day today, it would say, your government at work.
Right.
We're here to serve you. We are you. Something. Because what should all of this do? It should not only improve the infrastructure, it should remind Americans of what government has done and can do, and it can restore the confidence that Americans once had in public initiative that nowadays is generally overridden in their imaginations by private corporate capitalist enterprises. Okay.
And there's an element of privatization in this bill, and I'm pretty sure, but correct me if I'm wrong, that nothing that FDR ever did involved the privatization of or private access to government resources and public goods, did it?
Yeah, no, the PWA did involve private contracts, but let me also add that.
No, but I'm not talking about private
Oh,
contracts. I'm
oh yeah.
talking about the actual privatization of a
No,
government
no. To
resource
my
or
knowledge,
asset.
there isn't a single instance of privatization.
Yeah.
Not at all. And I will also remind everyone the good example of the difference between past and present is that Social Security is public. Obamacare was a grand gift, to
Right.
who, right? Big pharma and the health insurance industry. I mean, look, the corporate powers that be, their conservative allies and their neoliberal allies have so transformed our imagination that it's hard to convince people that we could ever do anything these days as a public enterprise. That somehow, we should if it has to do with public communications, leave it to the likes of Google and Facebook and all of those folks, or to Comcast and so on.
Right.
No, it was definitely a different day and a different order, and that kind of people don't quite also realize that after the war, FDR passes away in 1945. World War II comes to an end soon after. That generation of Americans wasn't just driving on better roads, which later were enhanced all the more if you think the interstate highway system is worth referring to. It's also the
I
case.
do. Yeah.
It's also the case that between the New Deal and the war effort, that generation, whether you like the term or not, the greatest generation, and I do, the fact is that they had seen what government, the federal government, their government could accomplish. Okay, not just the resurrection of a nation out of the depths of the Depression, but also the defeat of fascism in World War II. And look, those two or more million young Americans who served in the CCC, let's remember, I think I've said this kind of thing to you before, when they were in, say, 1935, when they were somewhere between 15 and 22, 25 years of age, later in the 1950s, and even more importantly in the 60s, those are the young folks who are now entering middle age who voted for liberals to pass environmental protection, workplace protection, marketplace protections. They came away
Medicare,
Medicaid, right? Immigration reform, civil rights, voting rights.
yeah.
I mean, what we desperately need right now are these bills, maybe on a grander scale, of course, but we also need something else. We need them to have truly involved masses of American young people working together to see each other as Americans. I mean, one of the things that came out of the CCC, the letters attest to this, is how many young people realized that they weren't just the kids of a Hungarian immigrant, or an Italian immigrant, or an East European Jewish immigrant. They were all part of some larger thing called America. And we, sure as hell nowadays, in the wake of the civil rights struggles of the 60s, we could use just that kind of thing to transcend the divide that Trump exacerbated along lines of race, ethnicity, and religion. And then on top of that, it's also the case that those young folks should be guaranteed certain things. Anyone involved in these infrastructure plans should be guaranteed three things. And this to me is the real test of Biden's determination to be FDR or not. So let him pick up that executive pen or pens that they have floating around on those desks, and let him sign these executive orders. First, anyone working in an enterprise or public endeavor that is paid for by way of these infrastructure dollars will be guaranteed health care. Two, anyone involved at such and such and such in those kinds of enterprises is paid for, it was paid by federal dollars, must be guaranteed at least a $15 minimum wage. And last but not least, let any company receiving federal dollars to pursue infrastructure bow to the reality of union organization and collective bargaining rights. If he I understand in the next bill, I think it's in the next bill, they've built in some of the PRO Act elements. I haven't had a chance yet to see the specifics. But And then someone will say, but wait, that'll be temporary. That means they have to win the next election. Well, do that and they might win the next election, right?
Right, exactly. And I guess that gets to another point, going back to this sort of vision of government, which is, I get it. In 2021, there's Joe Manchin and there's a slim margin, and we can argue about why there's a slim margin. I would argue
Right.
this absence of a vision contributes substantially to that. But okay, here we are. That explains why they might not be able to pass a truly transformative law of a FDR like nature. But it doesn't, it's no reason why they can't continue to articulate or begin to articulate an FDR like vision of what government's role in society should be,
Right.
bearing in mind that the other FDR program we haven't mentioned, and I know it's not infrastructure, but is Social Security, which, as you
Yes.
well know, he envisioned as the foundation. People associate the name Social Security with the retirement and disability program we have now, but the name, if people think about it, really suggests a much broader vision of security from cradle to grave, I believe, as he put it, or Francis Perkins or somebody involved in it put it. And that involves healthcare, and that involves, from the government and all sorts of other things. And unemployment was written into it, but given to the states. And so, not articulating what you would do if you had the votes and the power in Congress, to me, remains a kind of very unfortunate omission, I guess I would say.
Yeah. Again, I'll put a human face on something and then I'll go on to this question of the vision. So this week, my older daughter and her family are with us. I have only one grandchild so far. I don't know if I'll have more, but my grandson, who is 6.5, asked me a question, which was really fascinating. We were heading out, he and I, to take a walk over to a park. And he said, Grandpa, now that you're retired, are you making any money? and I, of course, I didn't tell him that you're paying me big bucks to do this show. No, of course, right?
Right, right.
No, I said, that's a really good question. And I explained to him how once upon a time there was a president, FDR, and how there was the creation of Social Security. And then I also noted that I had a university pension. But the point was, he asked the question, do you have security? Now, by the way, before 1935, 36, 37, any kid, grandkid who asked that of their grandparents would have had a very terrible answer. Okay. Yeah. No, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, I have to keep working that kind. I have to go back and get an additional job. I have to go be a greeter at Walmart or something, right? I mean,
right.
Something like that. Right. But now to come to the vision, you're absolutely right. The experience of the many who I hope get to work in these infrastructure projects, I hope that they will come away with a vision of their own because of that work. But it really is the case. I'm gonna bellyache now. I don't hear anything out of these Democrats that gives me confidence that they even have a vision. Okay. Now, I know that, Biden maintains a certain kind of decorum when he speaks, but he makes little reference to history. It's Bernie who has to talk. He makes the reference to FDR on occasion. I mean, it's striking how here's the thing. Democracy is at stake. That's the ultimate question. What are we going to do to secure this democratic America, or at least secure the promise of America, that it shouldn't be flushed down the toilet should the return of Trump or the ascendance of the likes of Josh Hawley, come into the game. Yeah. So where's the vision? But unfortunately, Biden isn't close enough to the folks like AOC. She probably has more vision than anyone right now in the administration, by the way. So it's striking to me that if they really want this to be transformative, let them remember that it takes not only the dollars, it takes the ideas and the rhetoric that connects to those experiences. The two work together. And that's what FDR did. I mean, he was, as other friends tell me, look, there's no way that Biden can give a great speech. He doesn't have it in him. But I'd like to see him get riled up, like when he wanted to go after the entitlements of Social Security and Medicare. When he was in the Senate, he could be riled up. Well, let him get riled up about the promise of American democracy and what it will take to rescue it from the jaws of the likes of the Republican Party.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think he's uniquely positioned to do that because he's seen as an affable man. He's not seen as abrasive. Or so to suddenly come out and say, you know what, I'm sick of this crap, we've got to stop, would I think be really effective. But I also, I keep coming back to, I feel as if we're kind of whistling past the graveyard here a little bit, literally in some senses, in that, I did a piece recently where I toted up all the political decisions that are costing American lives alone,
Yeah.
not to mention global lives. And
Oh,
every couple minutes somebody dies because we're neglecting a political issue or ignoring a political issue, whether it's underinsurance for health insurance, uninsurance for health insurance, inequality, poverty, environmental pollutants. And, here we are with basically bodies falling all around us, and nobody's saying, hey, you know what? Let's stop the dying. Let's stop it right now, whatever it
right.
takes. And now we've got this eviction moratorium extended, but people still can't pay their rent. What are they going to
Right.
do
Right.
when a year's worth of rent comes due, and we're just kicking that can down the road? How about you know what? Everybody deserves a place to live. Let's. If I also want to see Biden riled up about that, about what, nobody should get kicked out of their house, and we'll do whatever it takes to keep them in. Nobody should die unnecessarily when we have the means to stop it. We'll give them health care, and I don't mean insurance, I mean health care, which is
Yes.
very different.
Exactly.
you
That's
know
right.
and we'll do it, and god damn it, we're going to stop this parade of death once and for all. Are you with me or are you not? I mean, I think it would be so compelling, and yet I see very little indication in the entire Democratic Party that anybody feels this visceral sense of, not to mention the planet is on freaking fire. So I don't get. I mean, yes, there are good people in there, and I appreciate
Sure.
AOC, and I love what Cory Bush did with the eviction, but I don't get this sense of hair on fire urgency that I think a transformative political party needs.
Yeah. So far, what I've seen is a series of contradictions out of this administration. Okay. And one of the contradictions appears in terms of this infrastructure plan. So let's not forget the infrastructure plan, as I just said, allows for the possibility that the monopoly telecom companies are going to once again have access to the kinds of things they're supposed to do and may not do it or not do it right. Okay. Well, only a few weeks ago, I was listening to somebody's podcast. I can't remember whose. And they were talking about the fact that the Biden administration had shown itself inclined to go to in the new, the new Brandeisian moment. The idea of not having these monopolies, the smaller corporations. And they noted the fact that Assistant Attorney General Jonathan, whose last name I'm blanking on, is it like Katner or something like that. And then Lena Khan was appointed to head the FTC. And these are both people who are
Right.
the new Brandeis folks. Well, I guess they didn't show them the infrastructure plan.
Right. Right. And also, by the way, we have to see, it's our obligation as citizens to hold their feet to the fire. And, Lena Khan's a great appointment. Jonathan, I also forget, Kempner or something,
Yeah.
is also a great appointment. But at the end of the day, Catherine Tai was a great appointment. It was great when they said they were for the vaccine patent waiver, but they haven't pushed for it. They haven't fought for it. They haven't lifted a finger for it.
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen whether, Brandeis, from what I understand, was a scrapper. And I'm waiting for the pugilism to begin on behalf of these ideas, not just to articulate for them, which is great. It's a step. But yes, Harvey, we could do this all
right.
day.
The thing to remember is we're in mid-August.
Right. It's a third of the way to the next election. It's a third of the way to the 2022 elections.
Right.
What have we got?
So I mean, if democracy matters, well, one last thing I want to point out, and then I know our time has run out, and that is that for all of his faults and failings, for all of his sins, FDR knew he needed a mobilized American population. He needed working people mobilized. That's how Wagner convinced him to sign the National Labor Relations Act. He already had signed, by the way, a similar act in 1933. Everyone thinks it was just 35. He had already signed into law something that was supposed to guarantee workers the right to organize. The point is, he told his cabinet in 1935, I believe it was 34, 35, that they should go out and speak to community groups and civil organizations and get them motivated, organized, and mobilized to keep big business honest, or at least to try to do that. I mean, he was willing to be pushed himself. He knew that it required. He once told a journalist when he was running for president, when she said to him, "How far out in front are you willing to go?" "Well, I don't want to go too far because I know I need not to leave them behind me. I need the push from my fellow citizens." And I don't think look, I think the Democrats have feared their fellow citizens for years. And that to me is the tragedy.
Yeah, I don't know any better way to conclude than that, and I think we could do a whole hour on that alone.
Anytime.
Let's plan on it. Man, I could tell you stories.
I mean, I know you could. I know you could.
But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. So Harvey J. Kaye, historian and sociologist and great friend of this program, thank you for sharing your insights with us. And as always, great to talk to you.
Thank you. I look forward to the next time.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.